Dear listeners, we would love to get to know you better. Please write in the comments which country and city you are watching us from. Thank you. I didn't always know where I was going, but I always had a rough idea of where I came from. I grew up in a small, hard-working town where everyone knew everyone was business, and nothing much ever changed. My family was blue-collar. My father worked the factory floor, and my mother kept the house running like clockwork. I spent my teenage years in and out of trouble, often getting into things I shouldn't like, and racing in small-time hustles. But in the back of my mind, I always felt a pull to something more, something beyond the small-town limits and the repetition of everyday life. At 19, I left home with nothing but a beat-up truck, a few $100, and a vague sense that there was more out there for me. I ended up in construction, working as a laborer. The work was tough, the hours long, but it was honest. By 23, I'd worked my way up to becoming a skilled carpenter. I'd learned that I had a knack for it, seeing the potential in rough timber and turning it into something sturdy, useful, even beautiful. But no matter how much I loved working with my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was too big to be confined to just one set of walls. That's when I met Julie. She worked at a local bakery, and when I saw her, I knew she was something special. At 19, I was still figuring out who I was. But Julie felt like the person I wanted to share it all with. We got married by the time I was 21. Life was supposed to be simple, right? A house, a couple of kids, a steady job. But it didn't work out that way. The economy hit hard, and with it, the construction industry collapsed. We tried to hold on, but soon enough the bills piled up, and the work dried up. At 24, after months of struggling, Julie and I sat down and made a decision. I was going to change careers. I was making promised steady pay and benefits, something we desperately needed. It wasn't exactly the life I had envisioned, but sometimes you have to sacrifice a little of what you want for the future you need. I signed up for driving school. Julie, ever supportive, encouraged me to do whatever it took to make things work. Within a few weeks, I passed my CDL test, and just like that, I was a truck driver. I didn't expect it to be easy, but I did it anyway. The road was calling, and I couldn't ignore it. People often dream about owning their own slice of paradise, imagining palm-fringed beaches in the Caribbean or South Pacific. However, a lesser-known but equally captivating destination awaits in Gananoque, a quaint town nestled in Ontario's Thousand Islands region along the St. Lawrence River. This area boasts a collection of islands adorned with homes and even castles, inhabited by both Canadians and Americans. While it may lack the tropical warmth of faraway retreats, the Thousand Islands offer a unique charm and breathtaking landscapes that rival the allure of exotic escapes. The region is also famously linked to the creation of Thousand Island dressing, which was supposedly invented by a local housewife and later made its way onto a New York hotel menu in 1890. However, there is no solid proof to back up this origin story. Before I started truck driving, I worked in construction and became a skilled carpenter by the time I was 23. I met Julie Simpson at 19 while working in a bakery, and we married when I was 21. However, the economic downturn due to the banking crisis hit the construction industry hard in July, and I decided I should switch careers to truck driving where the pay was better, even though it meant being away from home for long stretches. My trucking company offered to cover the cost of my driving school, provided I worked for them for a year after obtaining my license. Julie and I agreed, and within 3 weeks I earned my Class A CDL. I spent a week training on city routes and another week on local routes. After a month of training, my instructor deemed me ready to take the wheel solo. About 9 months into my local driving, my dispatcher Shirley called with an unusual assignment. The company owner had purchased an island in the Thousand Islands and needed furniture delivered from Vancouver. The catch was, I had to deliver it a month earlier than planned, and I was instructed to keep it a secret. Shirley handed me the keys to a brand new Peterbilt truck, saying it was mine for the job. I was to pick up the furniture in Vancouver and deliver it to Gananoque the next day. I told Julie about the trip, and while the pay was good, neither of us liked the idea of me being gone for nearly 2 weeks. We decided to make the most of our remaining time together. A while back, we had taken some intimate photos of Julie so I could carry a little piece of her with me on the road. But this time, I left the photos behind. The border crossing into Canada was smooth, as usual. While my truck was being searched, I called Shirley, who told me the furniture was ready for pickup. After arriving in Vancouver, it took about an hour to unload and then reload the furniture carefully. After crossing back into the U.S., I headed toward Montreal. When I reached Kingston, I parked for the night and called Shirley again. She told me the boss was already on the island, and I was to go to the commercial dock first thing the next morning to load the furniture onto a barge. The barge ride took about 45 minutes, and when I arrived on the island, I made my way to the guest house, expecting to surprise the boss. However, when I walked in, I was stunned to find him massaging something into a woman's chest. At first I thought it was sunscreen and assumed it was his wife, but then I realized the woman was Julie, and she was without clothes. Shocked, I cleared my throat. They turned around, and while the boss didn't recognize me, Julie did. I coldly said I brought the new furniture from the dock, and then added to Julie, "Maybe you should put some clothes on before I get back." I turned and walked out, heading back to the dock. I realized I was now stuck on the island. Seeing a few boats nearby, I decided to take one, figuring I could manage it even though I had never driven a boat before. I started the engine, untied the boat, and sped off. The ride back to the mainland was fast, but I crashed the boat when I reached the pier. After grabbing my belongings, I drove into town and caught a flight to New York. Julie left me a message asking me to call her back, but I chose to call Shirley instead. "How long?" I asked. "About 3 months," she replied. I was stunned. "So you knew the boss was sleeping with my wife?" "There were only 2 of us who knew, Joey and me," she admitted. I hung up, feeling betrayed. "Thanks, Shirley. Thanks a lot." Shirley asked where I was and what I planned to do next, but I just ended the call. I realized then why Shirley didn't want me to tell Julie about the trip. She knew Julie would have told Bradley, and the surprise would have been ruined. The airport was small, and I kept an eye out for either of them, but they never showed up. The flight was quick, and I drove 4 hours home only to find Julie wasn't there. Her voicemail message said, "Scott, if you're home, I'm on my way. Please don't do anything until we can talk. We've never had sex, Scott. We just played a little. Please believe me." I played a little, I thought. She really thinks I'm that stupid. When I got home, I packed up my truck and walked to the terminal where I found Shirley and Joey. They didn't acknowledge me at first, only glanced over when they realized who I was. I spoke coldly to Shirley. "How much do I owe you, Shirley?" She hesitated, then started, "Scott, I cut her off. "Write me a check for everything the company owes me." Shirley replied, "Mr. Bradley said not to give you anything until he talks to you." I stood my ground. "Shirley, you owe me," she added. "He said you crashed one of his boats." I scoffed, the words spilling out bitterly. "And what else did he say? Did he tell you he was sleeping with my wife? Did you 4 laugh at me behind my back?" I repeated more firmly this time. "Write me the check, Shirley." After a tense pause, she reluctantly handed me the check, but instead of taking it, I instructed them to transfer the money directly to my card. I didn't say anything else before walking away. Next, I drove to Bradley's house. His wife answered the door, looking pale and sickly. "I'm Scott Mann," I said, introducing myself. "I used to drive for your husband. This morning I found him rubbing sunscreen on my wife's chest and moving lower. I thought you should know." I paused for a moment, then added, "Have a nice day," before turning and leaving. She asked for my name and Julie's name, then questioned me again. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. Do you really think I'd make something like that up about my own wife?" I shot back. With that, I turned and walked away. I left my parents' house and drove to a nearby fast food spot to clear my head. Over coffee, I told them everything that had happened. Not long after, I was sprawled out on the couch trying to process it all. I was jolted awake by the sound of my dad yelling at Julie outside. "Julie, get off my porch or I'll call the cops." "But I need to talk to Scott," she pleaded. "After what you did, get off my porch." He snapped. Julie screamed my name, but I stayed silent. I was too hurt to respond. After a while, I walked to my truck and found her sleeping inside. When she woke up, she immediately began pleading. "Scott, please." "I had no choice," she said, her voice desperate. I spoke coldly, my anger evident. "Don't lie to me," she snapped back defensive. "So you either let someone sleep with you or you don't, right?" I shook my head, frustration rising. Everything about this was wrong. She seemed to soften, but I wasn't done. "So you did it willingly?" I demanded. Her eyes dropped, and after a pause, she admitted, "Okay, I did." I looked at her, disgusted. "And you lied saying we never had sex, just played around. Do you really think I'd buy that?" I said, getting angry. "Get out of my truck." She refused to move, so I dragged her out of the truck, furious. Then I drove off, trying to escape the mess we had both created. I stopped at a fast food place to eat, barely tasting the food as I ate quickly, then went straight to the bank to divide our finances. My phone buzzed several times, including a message from my former boss, Ernest T. Bradley. He threatened to sue me for damaging his boat and accused me of threatening his employees. His second message was even worse. "I slept with your wife. Deal with it. This happens all the time. If you don't give her what she wants, I will. Now get back here and drive my truck, or I'll report you for theft." What a piece of work. I called Bradley's wife, and she agreed to meet. I played her the voice messages, and she looked furious after hearing them. "I'll set his A on fire," she said, her voice seething. She then asked if I was planning to divorce Julie, and I told her that was the plan, though I wasn't sure how to approach it. She advised me to get a good lawyer. Back at my parents' house, we talked things over. They gave me the same advice, so I started searching for a lawyer. After browsing through the phone book, I found David Dennison, a former truck driver turned lawyer after a car accident left him paralyzed. He knew Bradley and was initially skeptical of my story, but after listening to the recordings, he started to believe me. He asked if I wanted a private or public divorce, and I told him I wanted a fast, inexpensive divorce, where I'd be upfront about the affair. Dennison warned me that proving infidelity without concrete evidence could be challenging, but we decided to move forward. He asked where Julie might be, and I said either at home, work, or possibly in Canada with Bradley. He arranged for the divorce papers to be served at her workplace. In the meantime, I moved out of my parents' house and into a small apartment. A week later, Julie was served the divorce papers at work. My dad, who owned a small welding shop, convinced me to help out with the business to get me out of the apartment. I wasn't thrilled about welding, but I needed a change. Julie tried to talk to me, but after the papers were served, everything went through our lawyers. About a month later, we had our first meeting. Julie's lawyer tried to get the infidelity charge dismissed, but I refused. Bradley's name was in the divorce petition, and Julie was desperate to have it removed. She was worried it would ruin his reputation. That's when I lost it. "Are you kidding me? He's a home-wrecking idiot who needs to be exposed," I yelled. Julie fired back. "If you treated me better, he wouldn't have had the chance." That set off a heated argument that was only stopped when we were separated. When we resumed, Julie pushed again to have Bradley's name removed, but I stood firm. "Why protect him?" I asked. "Are you planning to marry him? Are you still sleeping with him?" "Yes, we're still dating. I'm still sleeping with him," she admitted flatly. Her lawyer groaned and put his head in his hands. "You just admitted to infidelity in front of your husband and 2 bailiffs. That's a big mistake." Julie shrugged, unfazed. "I don't care. Yes, I'm marrying him as soon as he's divorced. I asked, so you think he loves you? July pulled out her phone and proudly showed me text messages from Bradley. That's not what he meant, she said. But I could see the doubt in her eyes. He just wanted to get under your skin. I laughed bitterly. At that moment, Dennison slid an envelope across the table to Julie. Her lawyer opened it and quickly scanned the contents. He handed it to Julie, who flipped through the photos and began reading the note aloud. Mr. Mann, this may help with your divorce. The first 5 photos were from Bradley's island trip 3 weeks ago, featuring his hairdresser's wife, who had left her husband to be with him. The next 6 were from our house, taken the previous week when I was away with my parents. Bradley had picked up another woman at a bar. I didn't recognize her, but I didn't care. She was just another mistake in a long list. The note was signed, Cynthia. The photos clearly showed Bradley with both women in various compromising positions. Julie shoved the photos back at me and stormed out of the room. I didn't see her again until the court hearing. The divorce proceedings were straightforward. Julie got half of our savings, her jewelry, china, silverware, clothes, and kept the apartment. Bradley's reputation took a nosedive, and his sports teams folded. Cynthia, the woman he'd been seeing, got half of everything, including the moving company and their home. The only thing Bradley kept was an island in Canada, which Cynthia didn't want. Bradley tried to bill me for truck driving school, claiming I'd broken our contract. Dennison fired back with a letter telling him to kiss our asses. A few months later, Cynthia called, telling me to ignore Bradley's letter and offering me a job as operations manager at a trucking company. I was tempted, but ultimately turned it down. Over the next year, I discovered a talent for metalworking thanks to my dad's guidance. I found I genuinely enjoyed it. I dated a little but never pursued anything serious. I saw Julie occasionally, and we exchanged polite greetings, but that was it. Bradley's business was sold and Cynthia disappeared from my life. I occasionally ran into Bradley, but I doubt he recognized me. During this time, I started creating custom metal pieces like weather vanes and mailbox stands in addition to repair work. One Sunday, while working on a weather vane, I sensed someone walk into the shop. It was July. She sat down quietly and after a long pause asked, "Can we talk?" "I have nothing to say," I replied, not looking up. "Then just listen," she said, leaning forward. She told me everything, explaining why she had cheated. "We had a good life, but Bradley fed me lies about you being gone all the time, treating me poorly and not making enough money. Over time, I started believing him. Shirley even backed him up, saying Mrs. Bradley approved of his affairs, even picking the women. She was naive and trusting, and they manipulated me. It didn't happen overnight, but eventually I gave in." She paused, then said, "I didn't plan to tell you this. I thought I'd make up a story to blame you. But today when I saw you working, I stopped and didn't know what to say. I guess I just needed to tell you the truth." I asked, "What do you want from this?" "For you to know that none of this was your fault. It was my selfishness and their manipulation. And whether you believe me or not, I never stopped loving you." I shook my head. "You can't love someone and cheat on them. You lied and wanted to marry him. Are you still with him?" She hesitated before answering. "No, I haven't seen him since the lawyer's office." We sat in silence for a moment before she stood up. "I guess I'd better go," I nodded without looking up. "You know the way out." She walked out without saying another word, and once the door clicked shut behind her, I found myself unable to focus on anything. The day passed in a blur, and I didn't get much done, except to further solidify my belief that my former boss was a great idiot, and my ex-wife had the intelligence of a rock. I couldn't help but wonder how things would have turned out if I hadn't made that trip to the island to surprise my boss. Would I still be driving a truck, still getting leftovers from her? I made up my mind right then. I'd rather build weather vanes and go broke than deal with all this mess. A week later, a flyer for the Renaissance Festival arrived in the mail. I'd never heard of it before. The flyer was filled with images of knights in armor, jousting tournaments and vendors, selling everything from swords to costumes. It was happening right down the highway in Maryland, and as I read through it, I learned that Maryland had two sports, jousting and lacrosse. I didn't believe jousting could be a real sport, so I looked it up. Turns out it was. I decided to check it out. I spent the day wandering around, browsing the vendor booths and people watching. There was money to be made at these festivals, and I realized that if I played my cards right, I could get a piece of it. I noticed sword makers, knife smiths, and gunsmiths working on site, but it was the armor and shields that really caught my attention. After the event, I went home and spent days researching how to make shields and swords. I even started looking up other Renaissance festivals to see where they were held. I built 5 shields and 7 swords, ready to take them to the next nearby festival. Turns out, there were many of these festivals all over the country. I arrived a day early to scope things out and met a vendor who seemed to be selling top-notch swords and knives. I made him an offer. I'd keep my stock on hand, and if it sold, he'd get a commission. He was hesitant, but eventually agreed. I planned to stay overnight, but with no rooms available near the festival, I drove home. I didn't trust strangers much, but I had no choice if I wanted to sell the items. The next morning, the vendor, Teddy Weckoff, called to tell me everything had sold. He sent me a check. I had a new business. Over the next few weeks, I worked on more pieces for upcoming festivals. Teddy wanted 10 swords and 10 shields for the next event, which was only a week away. I managed to prepare 4 of each. Meanwhile, I continued helping my dad with his welding shop. One day, we got a call to repair a driveway gate. Apparently, my daughter's boyfriend had driven through it instead of waiting for it to open. I was told booze was involved. When I got there, I saw the huge gate lying in pieces across the gravel driveway. The house beyond the gate was massive. I met the owner, Mr. James Jameson. Initially, I turned the job down because I thought it was too big for us to handle. This gate was almost 12 feet tall, but I decided to give it a shot. If I screwed up, it would only cost some time and a bit of metal. I spent the better part of the day figuring out which tools I would need, then went back to the shop to grab what I could. The next day, I returned to start the repair. I'd been working for a couple of hours when a woman about my age brought me iced tea. Her name was Hannah, and she lived in the house. It was her boyfriend who had caused the damage. I had my own snacks, but she came out twice with iced tea and stayed to chat both times. Over the next 2 days, I spent a lot of time bending, twisting, welding, and straightening the metal. By the end of the second day, I'd fixed the gate. Hannah was there again, bringing drinks and a good sense of humor. I found myself enjoying her company. Around this time, I became even more interested in armor. It was clearly popular at the festivals, and I was curious about how it was made. How long did it take? How much would it cost? And could I make a profit? I was dating a woman I'd met at the library while doing research. We met at least twice a week, and every time we ended up sleeping together. But as was often the case, the relationship fizzled out after a few weeks. One Friday night, I was sitting at a local bar, watching a baseball game and drinking beer, when Hannah sat down next to me. "I'm meeting some friends for a drink. Want to join us?" she asked. "No thanks," I said, not even looking up. "I'm good right here." She stood up, about to leave, but then paused and turned back to me. "Are you ever going to tell me what I did to make you angry?" I didn't even glance up for my drink. "If I have to explain it to you, then I feel sorry for you," I replied coldly. "Enjoy your drinks." Without another word, she left. I felt a sting of frustration, but I didn't let it show. A few days later, I was back at her house to work on some railings near the pool. Mr. Jameson had called me back to finish the job. When I saw Hannah, she came over to say hello, but she never mentioned the incident at the bar. I was a little irritated by her complete lack of acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, and I wasn't in the mood for small talk. I think she took the hint because she quickly left me alone. The next day, I came back to finish up with some spare parts for the railings. It was a quick job, so I got it done in no time. As I was working, Hannah came by again to chat. I mostly ignored her. Our conversations had been pleasant before, but after the way she'd acted, I wasn't interested in talking anymore. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her eyes filled with hope. I didn't look at her as I responded. "Do you remember what happened at the movies last week?" She seemed to recall, replying, "You mean when I was with the octopus?" "Yeah," I said, my tone flat. "What about it?" she asked, genuinely unsure. "You asked me to take you home," I said, my voice turning sharp. "Do you remember that?" She nodded. "Of course," I pressed on. "And what happened after that?" "Nothing," she replied casually. "Jimmy showed up and took me home." I stared at her, trying to process my thoughts. "And you didn't see anything wrong with that?" She looked at me, unbothered. "No," she said, her face unreadable. "Was it bad?" I asked, pressing further. "Not if you didn't see anything, I guess," she answered almost dismissively. I grabbed a hammer and began pounding on the metal, using the noise as an excuse not to look at her. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered. She sighed in frustration. "I think I get it." I didn't respond, just kept hammering away. She got the message and left. I finished the railings and went home. Despite all this, my fascination with armor didn't fade. I continued to research how it was made, and even crafted my first piece. I was proud of it and sent a photo to Teddy to get his opinion. "Stick to shields and swords," he texted back with a laugh. "You're good at that. Armor needs a lot more work before anyone's going to buy it." A few days later, I was at the bar, nursing a beer and watching a game, when Hannah slid into the seat next to me. "I'm meeting some friends for drinks. Want to join us?" she asked. "Nah, I'm good right here," I said without even glancing up. She stood up to leave but then stopped, hesitated, and turned back toward me, almost like she was looking for something in my face. "Are you ever going to tell me what I did to piss you off?" she asked. "If I have to explain it." "I feel bad for you," I said, my voice flat. "Enjoy your evening." Just as I was finishing my beer and getting ready to head out, she came back. "Scott, I didn't mean to ignore you at the theater," she said, rushing the words out. "Like I pissed me off so much I didn't know what I was doing. I'm really sorry. Can we just forget it?" I figured someone at her table must have pointed out how she'd acted. "Apology accepted," I said, trying to sound cool. She smiled, clearly relieved. "Will you come join us now?" she asked, hopeful. "All right, let's grab a drink," I said. "I owe you that." "Thank you," she replied, a grateful smile spreading across her face. The night turned out to be unexpectedly fun. Two friends, who I still couldn't remember by name, kept reminding Hannah to be polite. I kind of felt bad for her, honestly. Eventually, the group split up, and we all left together. Later, I met up with Ginny and sat down next to her. I didn't waste any time before asking about Hannah. "She's been my friend for a while," Ginny said. "Look, I'm not her closest friend, but I'm close enough. She's into you, though. She feels bad about how she treated you." "Great," I muttered, not impressed. Ginny continued, "Well, she told the whole table what happened. Give her some credit for that. I didn't want to drag this out." "Call her," I said, getting straight to the point. Ginny raised an eyebrow. "Do you have her number?" "No," I replied. "Hand me your phone," she said, her tone firm. I handed it over, and Ginny wrote down Hannah's number. "Call her," she urged. The next week, I was working in the shop when Hannah walked in. I assumed she'd gotten the address from her father. "Did you enjoy yourself the other night?" she asked. "It was fine. Your friends are cool," I said, keeping things casual. "That's good," she said, then added, "But what about me?" I raised an eyebrow. "What about you? Do you like me?" she asked, her eyes locking on mine. "I already apologized, if you remember," I said. "I remember," she replied, almost quietly. "Then why aren't we friends?" she asked, her tone genuinely confused. I grinned. I think we're getting there. An apology doesn't guarantee friendship, I said, leaning back a little. It just means you recognize you messed up, and you regret it. You apologized because you realize what you did was wrong. Whether I accept it or not is up to me. I accepted it, but that doesn't mean we're best friends now. It just means I get that you understand and are sorry for your actions. Assuming the apology is real, I added. It was, she said, her voice firm but gentle. I agreed, I said. All right, then let's go grab dinner, she said, a spark of excitement in her voice. Why not? I laughed. It'll be a good way to build our friendship, she said, giving me a teasing smile. Fine, when? Tonight. And just like that, we went. The dinner was nice, and our bond grew stronger. We ended up dating for a couple of months before things got more intimate, but that was just the start. Our connection deepened quickly, and soon we couldn't stand being apart for too long. She'd come by the shop just to hang out. No need for talking. Just being in the same space was enough for both of us. I worked, she read, and everything just felt easy. One night, as we were lying in bed, I learned a lot more about her. She'd been married for a brief time, but what really surprised me was when she told me Jonah Jameson wasn't her real father. She said her biological parents had been married only 7 years, and she had an older brother. Her father passed away, and a couple of years later, her mom remarried Jameson. Her brother, Ernest, had wanted to take over the trucking business their dad owned. Despite people thinking he was too young, but with their mom's support, he took the reins and the business thrived. I poured us both a drink and crawled back into bed. Tell me more about your brother, I said. I've already told you the basics, she replied. The company was doing great. Then Ernest and my ex-sister-in-law bought this island in Canada, and things got messy. She got involved with some guy, and it all ended in a divorce. They sold the company. Apparently her new guy started working for Ernest, thinking they could make money off him. Then the wife seduced my brother, and they set it up so that her husband would catch them together on their island, I said. My sister-in-law divorced him, took half the company, and they had to sell it off. What a bunch of thieves, she added, her voice full of contempt. I knocked back my drink in one go. How much did they take him for? I asked. My brother never told me the full amount, but I know they squeezed something out of him, she said. Do you know who they are? I knew them, but I've forgotten the names, I said. I thought about telling her the whole truth, but I wasn't sure it was the right time, so I decided to sleep on it, at least for one more night. After the best sex I'd had in a long time, I almost convinced myself not to tell her. But deep down, I knew I had to. I couldn't keep hiding this. I was getting late, and I was about to leave her place. I stood up, started putting on my shoes, and sat back down on the bed. Time to talk, I said, breaking the silence. I took a deep breath. Let's go back to the story about your brother's divorce. Was that the official story, or was that just his version? I asked. Why do you ask? She said, looking confused. That's what he told me. Because it's all wrong, I said. I finally told her the whole truth. About halfway through, she jumped out of bed completely without clothes and just stood there watching. By the time I finished, I told her the only outcome of Julie and my situation was a divorce, not blackmail or anything like that. When I was done, all she said was, "You're lying. Get out." "I'm not lying," I responded, my voice steady. "This is what really happened." She grabbed a pillow and threw it at me. "You're lying. Get out. And don't ever come back." With that, I left. I hated how it ended, but at the same time, I couldn't deny that the last time we were together was incredible. Life went on, and I tried to move forward. For a while, I couldn't shake the feeling of being stuck. No matter what I did, I couldn't seem to break free from that rut. One night, I decided to treat myself and went out to a nice restaurant for dinner. I finished my meal, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and looked around. That's when I saw Hannah and her brother a few tables over. They had a small cake with candles on their table. I signaled the waiter to bring me the bill, paid it, and got up. I walked right over to their table and sat down. They both stared at me, clearly caught off guard. Her brother was the first to speak. Are you sure this is your table?" he asked, not recognizing me. "Yes," I replied calmly. "And I think it's time you told your sister the real story about your divorce." Hannah frowned and looked at me. "She knows about it," she said, sounding defensive. "Obviously, she doesn't know the whole truth. You need to tell her what really happened," I said, leaning in. Her brother shot me a glare. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. "I'm someone who knows the truth, and I think it's time you told her," I said. "Screw you," he muttered. "Scott, what are you doing?" Hannah almost shouted, her voice rising. "Get out of here," she added, more calmly this time. That's when the waiter suddenly appeared. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. "This guy," Hannah said, pointing at me, came over uninvited and started threatening my brother. "I want him to leave." "Of course, ma'am," the waiter said, stepping in. I looked at her brother first. "You're a real piece of work." Then I turned to Hannah. "I don't know why you never talked to your brother's ex-wife, but check the courthouse records. You'll see the truth for yourself. Just leave," she said coldly, not even meeting my eyes. So I walked out, deciding that would be the last time I'd see her. I threw myself into my work, mostly making axes and chainmail. I was too busy to deal with her or think about her. A festival was coming up the next weekend, so I packed up some of my work and took it to Teddy's. He got me a vendor pass, and I drove over to the event. When I arrived, Teddy was talking to a woman in a period costume. She was wearing a long, flowing dress with a bodice cut so low it was almost scandalous. I stood off to the side, waiting. Teddy saw me, smiled, and waved me over. "Diana meets Scott. He's the guy behind some of the gear we use, and I hear he's got some new stuff to show us." I laughed. "That's what I do. I just got some fresh pieces from my truck." They added, leading them both over. They stood there staring at the items like they'd found hidden treasure. I couldn't help but keep stealing glances at Diana's bodice. Every time she leaned forward, I did too, hoping for a better view, but it was too crowded. I spent the rest of the day with them, even having dinner with them. We ate meat pies and iced tea from a nearby vendor. I wanted to ask about their relationship, but it didn't feel like the right moment. There were so many people walking around, reconnecting with old friends and festival contacts. Half the crowd was in period costumes. Some men were practicing sword fights in preparation for the battles that would take place the next day. I don't think I'd ever seen so many people having so much fun. Teddy had a tent set up in the vendor section, so I stayed with him that night. When things calmed down, I asked about Diana. She and her sister organized this festival and a bunch of others across the country, he explained. "She's a big deal. We've been friends for years. Honestly, if you hadn't shown up today, she would have been the one to do the introductions." "Oh, Dan," I said. "Why didn't you tell me? I'd have booked a room at a motel." "No way," Teddy laughed. "There are no rooms within 50 miles. The next day, when the visitors started arriving, the reenactors had even more fun interacting with them. Diana, as always, was a major hit. I spent the whole weekend with Teddy. He and Diana would head to his tent while I ran the stall. I got plenty of time to talk with other vendors and festival goers. We sold everything Teddy had in stock, plus a lot of what I brought. It was a profitable weekend. I started thinking about attending more festivals. The event wrapped up on Sunday, and I helped Teddy pack up his stuff. It was an 8-hour drive home, but he convinced me to stay the extra night. Their next festival was 18 hours away, and they needed to start prepping by Wednesday. "I don't think I'll have enough time to make more chainmail," I said. "I hang my workbench. I'll try," I added, heading home after another long day. I went straight to my workshop and began working. Hours passed, and before I knew it, I was yawning. I hadn't slept much over the weekend. The clock read almost 2 a.m. when I finally decided to head home. I got back around 3 a.m., not 5 minutes after I'd walked through my door. The doorbell rang. I opened it, and Hannah literally collapsed into my arms, smelling heavily of booze. 2 police officers stood behind her. "Are you Scott Munn?" one of them asked. "Yes," I replied. "Is she your girlfriend?" he asked. "I know her, but she's not my girlfriend," I said. "You sure?" he pressed. "Not even close. The last time I saw her, she called me a liar and kicked me out. So no, I'm not her boyfriend." Which technically wasn't the whole truth, but they didn't need to know that. "All right, let's take her in," the officer said. His partner Tommy stepped forward, grabbing her hand. "Are you taking her?" I asked. "She'll spend the night at the station," the officer said. "No, don't do that," I protested. "I'll look after her." "You sure?" the officer asked. "No," I said, "but I can't let her stay at the station." "I'll take care of her." I helped her inside and laid her down on the only bed I had, mine. I would have slept on the couch, which was in better condition than the air mattress in Teddy's tent, but I still preferred my own bed. Instead, there she was, lying there, snoring peacefully. The next morning, I headed to work. I didn't expect to hear from her, and I figured she'd still be asleep when I returned. But when I got back, I found the apartment empty and everything was immaculate. I went straight to the shower, hoping to find a note or something, but there was nothing. I spent the day working, though I didn't manage to finish a single new piece of mail. Teddy came by to pick up some shields, swords, and axes I'd been storing. We briefly discussed hiring a few extra hands, but the shortage of skilled metalworkers made that impractical. Instead, we decided to focus on training. We placed ads in the local newspaper and the festival's newsletter, hoping to attract some interest. By Friday evening, I was back in the workshop working on a machine to speed up my chainmail production. There were machines out there, but I thought I could improve on them. It was late, and I was exhausted when there was a knock at the door. To my surprise, it was Hannah, completely sober. "It's for helping me out with the police," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. I nodded. I did what I could. "Is everything okay?" I asked, but she didn't respond right away. We just stood there, looking at each other in silence. "Listen, it's been a long day, and I need to get some sleep," I said, rushing past her to lock the door behind me before heading to my car. "Good night," I added, starting to walk away. As I was almost to my car, I heard her call after me. "You were right. My brother lied. I'm sorry." I just waved without turning around, got into my car, and drove off. The armor I'd been working on was something that truly captivated me. After Teddy criticized my first piece, I threw myself into research and redesigned it. It was a lot of work, time-consuming and physically demanding, but I loved the challenge. I felt confident enough to present it at the next festival. Teddy loved it. We could have sold it multiple times, but we kept it as a sample of my craftsmanship. People were impressed, and we had plenty of conversations about custom orders, offering to make adjustments based on their preferences. Festival life was treating me well, and the profits were good. I bought a trailer to transport my gear, which made moving between festivals much easier. Sometimes I worked right at the stall in front of visitors, other times in a private supplier's area. One evening during a break between festivals, I spoke with my father and mentioned how amazed I was at the success of Renaissance metalwork. "I never thought so many people would be interested in buying armor. And it's not cheap either," I said. The festival season eventually came to a close, and I began seeing a girl I'd met while looking at trucks at the local dealership. My dad's old welding truck was on its last legs, so I'd been thinking about getting a new one and adding welding equipment to it. While I was admiring a truck outside the showroom, I started chatting with her, and we ended up exchanging numbers. A week later, we went on our first date, and things just kept moving forward from there. One night I dropped her off after dinner, and she invited me in. We had another drink, and as I sat on her couch, she stood in front of me, unbuttoning her blouse. "Do you mind if I get more comfortable?" she asked. "Nope, if you don't mind me watching," I replied with a grin. She smiled mischievously. That's the whole point, isn't it? I undress while you watch, then you undress while I watch. Then we get to the good part. Sounds like you thought this through, I teased. Oh, I have, she said as she slipped out of her blouse, revealing a lacy bra. The skirt was next to come off, and I reached for the waistband of her underwear, but she gently pushed my hands away. Let me do this, she said. Just watch and enjoy. You like to undress in front of a guy, don't you? I asked. I don't know, she laughed. I've never had anyone complain. Her bra flew off and landed on top of her skirt. You're pretty confident, I remarked. Oh, I know, she smirked. Your turn. I started to unbutton my shirt. Slow down there, she said, her eyes sparkling. We got all night. I took my time, and she looked me over with a slow, appreciative gaze. I kicked off my shoes and loosened my belt while she unzipped my pants. As I started to pull them down, she knelt in front of me, her hands resting on her hips. She looked up at me with a playful grin. What's next? T-shirt or shorts? What do you want? I asked. T-shirt, she replied. Saving the best for last, huh? I said as I slipped off my shirt and tossed it aside. She picked it up and inhaled deeply. God, I love the smell of men, she purred. I left around 3 a.m. as the night came to an end. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about her, comparing her to Hannah. I couldn't decide which of them was better. That relationship lasted about 4 months before we broke up. When I got home, I checked my phone. It had been buzzing all night. There were 3 messages from Hannah. Scott, please call me when you get this. I don't care what time it is. I figured it must be important, so I dialed her number. She picked up after 2 rings. Hello, Scott, she said, her voice slightly slurred. Did I wake you? I asked. I think I was dozing off, she replied. I waited up for your call. All right, I called. What's going on? I asked. I wanted to tell you that my brother lied about his divorce, she said quietly. You were right, and I'm sorry. You've already apologized for that. Is there more? I asked. Yes, she paused, her voice wavering. Can we see each other again? I miss you. I took a deep breath before responding. Honestly, I don't think it's possible for us to be together. Not with your brother in the picture. Not after everything that happened with my wife. If we were serious, we'd always be at odds with him, and I'd never feel comfortable with it. I'm not willing to put myself in that situation. I could hear her breathing heavily, trying to hold back tears. I knew you'd say that, she whispered. But I hope you wouldn't. Goodbye, Hannah, I said quietly before hanging up. The Renaissance Festival season was back in full swing. I secured my passes, bought a tent, gathered some camping gear, and hit the road. Most of my time was spent helping Teddy run his booth, and when I wasn't doing that, I focused on creating new items to sell. Over the off-season, my armor-making skills had improved a lot. And by the time the festival started again, we were selling at least 1 piece of armor at each event. We could have sold more, but each piece took a lot of time and effort to make. A couple of days after one festival ended, Teddy called asking if I could help him at the next one. Of course I agreed. Since he lived near the site, he brought his trailer, fully loaded with everything I would need. I left my own trailer at home, packed up my truck, and took his. I worked at 3 festivals in a row, making several billboards and demonstrating my chainmail machine by the 3rd one. It was a busy stretch, but I enjoyed it. The next festival was near Philadelphia and would last 11 days. It was one of the largest festivals in the country. Most festivals ran Thursday through Sunday, but this one was extended, running through 2 weekends. I spent 2 weeks at home preparing for it, mainly working on armor. My father had become quite skilled at making shields, swords, and axes, and we both worked long hours. One late night, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a very drunk Hannah stumbling into my arms. "Is this your girlfriend?" One of the 2 officers accompanying her asked. "If it keeps her off the street tonight, I suppose so," I replied. I half carried her to the bedroom and tossed her onto the bed. I quickly showered, shaved, changed into pajamas, and grabbed clothes for the next day, just in case she decided to puke all over again. The next morning, she was still asleep, and I debated whether I should stay and talk to her or just move on. I chose to go to work. When I came home that evening, the apartment was spotless. We'd even cleaned the kitchen. But I noticed something odd. My toothbrush and toothpaste weren't where I left them. I put them back in place, noticing the toothbrush was wet and the washcloth by the sink was damp too. I grabbed an enchilada from the freezer and microwaved it, though I didn't end up eating it. The next morning, I left for the Philadelphia festival, bringing all the materials I'd need for shields and chainmail demonstrations. The first day was incredible, and things only got better from there. On Sunday, a crowd watched me work almost the entire day. By the time the festival closed, both Teddy and I were wiped out. Evenings in the vendor area were always a mix of partying and socializing. People cooked, played music, drank, practiced sword fights, repaired armor, took care of horses, and of course had sex. It wasn't uncommon to hear the sounds of closeness coming from tents or see a camper rocking from inside. One evening, after things had quieted down, I sat outside my tent, thinking about how nice it would be to have someone to cuddle with. Hannah crossed my mind, but I just couldn't bring myself to call her. Monday was a quieter day. No big crowds, but enough foot traffic to keep things steady. As I was demonstrating how tedious it is to assemble chainmail, I looked up and saw Hannah standing there watching me. I continued the demo and invited anyone to ask questions, but the crowd soon dispersed. Hannah stayed though. "Do you enjoy doing this?" she asked. "Yeah, I do," I replied. "You're good at it," she said, before turning and disappearing into the crowd. That was the last time I saw her until the festival ended. My parents showed up on Wednesday, bringing more shields and axes. I gave them a tour of the event, though they didn't seem too thrilled with what I was doing. My mom especially hated setting up my tent. The rest of the week went smoothly, and both Teddy and I were happy with how things turned out. When I got back home, I decided to take a day off. I went to the store, and when I returned, my father was working on chainmail for me. I was talking about my plans to get a larger motorhome and trailer when the door opened, and Hannah walked in. "This festival was fun," she said, sounding upbeat. "Some of my friends and I are going to the next one, which isn't too far from here. We might even go in armor, should be a blast." I gave a non-committal response, not really engaging. "Are you going?" she asked, looking at me with interest. "Probably," I replied, keeping my answer short. My father and I continued working without acknowledging her presence. "Can I come with you?" Hannah asked eagerly, stepping closer. "It's not really practical," I said. "I'll be there from Wednesday to Sunday." "No problem. We can get a motel room," she suggested, as if it were an easy fix. "Good luck with that," I said. "The motels sell out months in advance." "So where do you sleep?" she asked, genuinely curious. "In a tent," I replied. "Sounds cozy," she commented, a smirk playing on her lips. "Maybe we could share," I said, teasing a little. She raised an eyebrow. "This tent's pretty small," she replied, clearly unimpressed. "Small ones can be fun," she teased. My father shot me a grin before walking away. Hannah then turned to me, her face taking on a serious expression. "Let's be real. You'll never forget that my brother slept with your wife. That means you and I can't have anything long-term." She glanced around to make sure my father wasn't nearby, then leaned in closer. "But that doesn't mean we can't have a casual arrangement. We enjoy being with each other, don't we?" I nodded, though I wasn't thrilled by the idea. "So why not just use each other?" she suggested. "You can date anyone, but if you're not getting what you need, I can take care of that. What do you think?" I looked at her, honestly unsure of how I felt. "You're the best thing I've had in a long time," I admitted. "But the idea of sharing you with someone else doesn't sit right with me. I can't stand the thought of sleeping with you, and then having you go off to be with someone else. Even if it's just for the night, I paused before continuing more firmly. We both need to find someone and respect that relationship. She came closer, touched my face gently, and kissed me. You don't understand, she whispered. I already have a relationship. If you want to see someone, go ahead. But know that I'll always be here for you. I don't need anyone else. I love you and I plan to honor that relationship. With that, she kissed me again and left. My father must have been watching because as soon as she was gone, he asked, "What are you going to do about her?" "I'm not sure," I replied, still processing everything that had just happened. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest? Either get used to the idea that her brother slept with your ex-wife and accept that she's not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady, "or keep a low profile and leave town for a while. Maybe now's the time to do what you and Mom have talked about." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "We'll talk about it when we get home," I said before changing the subject. At dinner that evening, my father mentioned to my mother what had just happened with Hannah. "So I think it's time we finally give Scott the gift we've talked about," he said. "I think you're right," my mom agreed. "What are you two talking about?" I asked, confused. "I don't like the idea of you sleeping in a tent," my mom said. "We're buying you a motor home." I didn't argue. Honestly, I was relieved, and I thought it was a great idea. It took a week to find the right motorhome. Luckily, I had a Class A CDL, so driving it wasn't an issue. I hugged my parents, thanked them, and got a trailer to pull behind it. I set up the trailer for work, adding power hookups so I could work on the go if needed. It was a great setup. While I worked on armor, my father continued making shields, swords, and axes. We were both enjoying the work and the business was thriving. Teddy, however, got a little jealous when he saw my new trailer. He asked, "So have you christened it yet?" "Christened it?" I asked. "You know," he grinned. "Has anyone had sex in it yet?" "No," I answered flatly. He grinned wider. "Do you mind if Diana and I couldn't help but laugh. "Go for it." He texted her, and she showed up in less than 10 minutes. He took her hand, and they began walking side by side, laughing as they returned. "We want you to be the first to know," he said, a big smile on his face. "Diana and I are getting married." She wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug. "It was your van that really got to him," she said. "Thank you. Didn't see much of them that weekend. But when I got back, my van had a different smell. Perfume mixed with something else, something faintly familiar. A week later, I was home when I saw Hannah pull up, eyeing the van. I'd been in a bit of a dry spell and figured it was a perfect opportunity. I gave her a tour of the van, and she seemed genuinely impressed. "This is way more than just a tent," she said, her eyes wide. "Yeah, it's a little more comfortable," I said with a smirk. "This is a queen-sized bed, right?" she asked, looking at the sleeping area. "Yep, and there's a pretty big closet too," I said, pointing. "I've got one of those," she teased. "I bet you do," I grinned. "This shower could easily fit two, by the way." "That's a plus," she replied with a wink. We were standing in the living area when she suddenly stepped closer to me, her voice dropping. "Has it already been, used?" she asked, a slight smile playing on her lips. I had a pretty good idea of what she meant, but I played dumb. "What do you mean?" she clarified, her tone teasing. "Has anyone slept with you in it yet?" I wasn't about to admit anything, so I lied. "Nope, it's brand new." She gave me a sly look. "Well, we can fix that now or wait until this weekend." Since we were in my parents' backyard, now wasn't really an option. "What do you mean by this weekend?" I asked, confused. "After the festival closes, we'll have plenty of time," she said, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. I shook my head. "I'm sorry, but the festival's in Southern Virginia." Even if I agreed, "It's too far for you to travel." She shrugged, but then added, "You're right, so I'll just go with you." I repeated more firmly. "Didn't you hear me? I said it's too far." Ignoring me, she started tugging at my shirt, pulling me toward her. "Scott, you admitted I have the best body you've ever had. You're the best I've ever had, too. And I'm in love with you. I know you like me more than just a little. Why don't we just make the most of it when we can? Also, I've got a dress for the festival that everyone's going to love." She kissed me softly, like we were in a real relationship. "Especially you," she added. "I'm leaving at 5 a.m. on Tuesday," I said quietly. "I won't wait for you," I muttered, though I wasn't sure I meant it. She kissed me again, with more urgency this time. "You don't have to." She was right. By midnight on Monday, she had unpacked her things, restocked the kitchen, and was already in bed in the van. When I got in the driver's seat early Tuesday morning, she was already in the passenger seat, dressed only in a robe. I couldn't help but notice how she glared at me every time I looked her way. She met Diana later that day, and both of them showed up wearing low-cut dresses that drew attention. I was counting down the minutes until the workday was over. At the end of the day, Teddy and I closed the booth, and when we got back to the van, Diana and Hannah had dinner ready. I'd never tasted anything Hannah made before, but it was fantastic. After Teddy and Diana left, Hannah asked if I wanted to join her for a shower. There was plenty of room for two, and after we were done, we made our way to the bed. That night was the first of many nights and days spent together in that van. That was 3 years ago. At first, her family tried to convince her that I was only allowing her to travel with me to get back at her brother. He had convinced them that July and I were to blame for his divorce, not him. None of them had been in court to hear the truth, and like Hannah, they believed him. Hannah eventually showed them copies of both my divorce petition and her ex-sister-in-law's petition. Her brother stayed in town for a while, causing a couple more divorces before deciding he needed to move to the other side of the country for his health. Now, Hannah has a wardrobe full of new dresses she wears to festivals. They don't highlight her growing belly as much. She never outright said it, but I can tell she's thinking about getting married before having kids. I can't stop thinking about it either. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.